Hey guys, do you know what this is? That's right, it is a Canadian passport. I mean, not my current passport, which we all know from watching a previous video I lost in a tragic series of circumstances a few weeks ago. This is an expired one, as we can clearly tell from the holes that they punched in the cover, as well as the amusingly out-of-date photo of me. But how do we know it is a Canadian passport? Well, it does say Canada in big letters at the top, but it also has the Canadian coat of arms on it. Coat of arms is just an old-fashioned term to describe what is basically a country's official logo. In Canada, our coat of arms appears all over the place. Now, every country has its own coat of arms, and some are much cooler than others, but I must say, I think that Canada's is one of the worst in the world. Alright, so, here it is. Now, let me explain all of the nonsense to you. So, on this side we have a lion, and then on this side we have a unicorn, and the unicorn is all chained up. And then on the top we have another lion and a crown, and he's standing on this weird helmet thing. And then under the helmet thing we have this big shield, and the shield is split up into these different sections, one of which has 3 yellow lions, one has a red lion, one has a harp, and one has 3 fleur-de-lises, and at the bottom there are 3 maple leaves. And then at the very bottom we see that everything is standing on a bunch of flowers. Now, don't get me wrong, this is a cool and interesting design, and it was a particularly cool and interesting design when the British designed it to be their own coat of arms several hundred years ago. For you see, this is the lamest thing about the Canadian coat of arms. It is almost an exact plagiarism of the British one. The 2 most identical coats of arms in the world. The lions, the unicorn, the helmet thing, the shield with the symbols, the flowers, everything. Now, in the context of the UK, all of these symbols make perfect sense. The lion represents England, and the unicorn represents Scotland. These are the 2 founding kingdoms of Great Britain, and since Scotland was conquered by the English, that is why the unicorn is all chained up. And then on the shield, we have medieval symbols representing other parts of the British Empire. So the yellow lions represent England, and the red lion represents Scotland, and the harp represents Ireland, and the fleur-de-lises represent France, back when France was owned by England too. And then it's basically the same story with the flowers at the bottom. We have the English rose, the Scottish... this is a hard word for me to say. The English rose, the Scottish thistle, the French lily, and the shamrock. Now, this poster is a up-to-date version of the Canadian coat of arms, which does have a few small differences from the UK one, but until quite recently, the Canadian coat of arms had basically no meaningful differences, as we can see in this picture in this 1978 guide to Canadian patriotic symbols that I own for some reason. The only meaningful difference in those days was that the Canadian coat of arms contained a few more references to France. The British had removed a lot of the references to France once they no longer owned France, but the Canadians put them back in, you know, because Canada does have a lot of French history. This includes the fleur-de-lises on the shield and the French lilies in the flowers, as well as these little French and British flags that they stuck at the top. And this extra part of the shield down here with the maple leaves. In 1994, the Canadian government modernized the coat of arms, but just barely. They made the animals more buff, turned this top thing into a bunch of maple leaves, added a ring with Canada's second national motto, which actually just made it look even more like the British one, and just generally drew the whole thing a little bit better. But the question is, why is Canada's coat of arms just a cheap ripoff of Britain's? Well, see, the Canadian coat of arms was officially adopted in 1921. This was back when Canada was still a British colony. Canada was a very modern and wealthy and democratic society, but it was also a colony, which was kind of weird. But the Canadian government in those days wanted everybody to think that being a colony of Britain was actually super awesome. There was always a lot of fear that if Canadians didn't think of themselves as British, they might think of themselves as Americans, and of course that would never do. So they put a lot of effort into sticking patriotic British symbols everywhere, like Union Jacks, and pictures of the King, and the British coat of arms. This was also a time when Canada was experiencing a lot of immigration from non-British parts of the world, which saw a big uptick in Anglo pride, as well as some people began to fear the loss of their country. The 1920s was also the time when Canada got its first official flag, which looked like this. As you can see, it has the shield thing from the coat of arms on it. Anyway, obviously no one thinks about Canada in any of this sort of way anymore. Canada is now fully independent of Britain, and the population is a lot more diverse. When Canadians think of patriotic symbols these days, they think of symbols that actually relate to the country they live in, not just symbols of an empire that no longer exists. Which is why the Canadian coat of arms is such a weird, out-of-date, dumb thing. Like, it would literally take about 5 seconds to come up with a better one. Here, watch. Okay, so check this out. So we got a beaver here, and then there's a moose on this side, and in the middle there's a shield with a big maple leaf, and there's like a totem pole thing at the top, And then we got the motto down here. I think that this tells you a lot more about what Canada's all about rather than this monstrosity. But let me know what you think. What do you think Canada should have on its coat of arms? What do you think are the most important symbols of Canada to include? Or do you maybe like the old one? Let me know in the comments, and if anybody comes up with a particularly good idea, maybe I will draw it for a future video. But for now, I guess I should get back to filling out my passport application form. See you next week! Don't forget to like and subscribe. Oh yes, and if you're ever interested in learning more about Canada, don't forget to visit my super awesome Canada information site called The Guide to Canada. It's got a ton of interesting articles and pictures and information about anything you could possibly want to know about this country of mine.